Okay, I think we'd like to get started again. Please, if everyone could take their seats. Alrighty, so Vanessa, if you'd like to come up and introduce yourself and
Hi, so I am Vanessa Chan. I just joined 7 weeks ago as a new professor in the engineering school. I am going to be doing a lot of work in the entrepreneurship program and leading senior design for the material science department. In terms of background, I spent 13 years at McKinsey & Company, co-leading the innovation practice, and so all this innovation is really near and dear to my heart. I also started a company to launch my own consumer product inventions and was on the Today Show, and you can find my invention on QVC. And I also am an angel investor. So I'm thrilled today to be able to do this fireside chat and introduce Justin Klein, who is a partner at New Enterprise Associates. It's an $18 billion asset under management firm that does a lot of work across a broad array of industries, including medical devices. And he joined in 2006. He does medical devices, healthcare, and biopharma. He served as a director on many of the companies that they are investing in and has seen quite a few of them divest out in terms of IPOs and acquisitions. And it's an impressive firm because they've had 650 companies, of which 500 went through liquidity events. As an angel investor, if I had that kind of odds, I probably won't be here much longer. So it's great to see and hear from someone who's had that kind of success. Prior to NEA, he worked at Duke Health System, reporting to the CEO on health system strategy, finance and clinical service unit operations, which really meant building the largest healthcare integrated delivery system, which means he'll have some really great insights for many of us here. He got his AB in economics and BS in biological anthropology and anatomy at Duke University. And later on, he concurrently earned his MD from Duke and his JD from Harvard. And I just wanted to point out to him that if he had been at Penn, he only would have had to walk 5 minutes to do both versus having to fly across the country to attend class. Just saying. And currently he's also on the board of trustees for Duke. So without further ado, Justin.
Thank you, Vanessa. And let me thank our co-directors and deans, faculty, and everybody who's here today. It's really a pleasure. I won't delve into this a lot, but I'm actually a big believer in centers for innovation and technology like this at universities. Spent a lot of my time academically at the intersection of different disciplines, and I think these are great opportunities for everybody at Penn to benefit from expertise across the campus and really solve some tough problems. So I'll spend a couple minutes just telling you a little bit about NEA so that you understand some of our firm and perspective as we think about investing in innovation broadly. I myself am a partner that focuses on healthcare and most often the medical device and medical technology space. We'll then talk a little bit about the sort of state of the innovation ecosystem, what's been happening in financial markets for startups and entrepreneurs as well as investors, and some of that will reflect the conditions that we see in our later stage partners and potential acquirers in our space, particularly in the medical device industry. And then I'll share a little bit more insight into how we're reacting to that environment and thinking about what's happening next, ways in which it informs our investment strategies. And then we'll be happy to take some questions from the audience as part of our fireside discussion. So as Vanessa mentioned, NEA is the largest and most active venture capital firm in the world. We're proud to have the support of our limited partners who trust us with in excess of $20 billion now to invest across multiple sectors, including information technology and healthcare as two very broad industries. Within each, we have different sectors, including medical devices, where we'll allocate capital through every fund. It's worth mentioning, I think, over the last 10 to 15 years, we've seen a lot of evolution in the medical device space in particular, and I'll sort of speak about that from my own experience, but also because I hope it's most relevant to the audience. It's been a challenging time through multiple cycles in the medical device space, but we have really stayed the course. Through our 40-year history, I think we've been one of the most active investors in the medical device space and continue to do so throughout the last 10. Even in the last 5 alone, NEA companies have been responsible for over 14 de novo, 510Ks, and PMA approvals, 10 of which I have sort of borne the brunt of in our portfolio. So as we talk about taking a long view and investing in innovation. We try to walk the talk. And proudly have been actively supporting companies to the tune of north of $1 billion in equity capital into our portfolio with our financial partners since 2015. Just to share a little bit more about how we think about investing, because I always think that when you hear advice or perspective from someone, it's good that you understand who they are. The way we think about investing in medical devices and medical technology is certainly informed by our posture and perspective in the market. We do believe that there are some advantages to our size, and we think about investing in ways that we can leverage our diversified portfolio perspectives, including from our information technology partners, our history of deep domain expertise and network, but also a strong capital base, which we think inures to our benefit and that of our companies when we take on some of the more capital-intensive and long-term opportunities in the market. We, of course, have to adjust as market cycles change, and there are different pressures, whether they're regulatory, reimbursement, what's happening with some of our later stage partners in the market. And of course, we try to develop strategies that proactively will address these opportunities, both offensively and defensively, for the benefit of our portfolios and our investment returns. So I want to spend a minute just talking about some of the issues that have, I think, pervaded people's perspective on the medical device investing space. We have been in a regular fundraising cycle every 2 to 3 years as a firm, and so when we go out and talk to our LPs, I'm often pitching our healthcare strategy broadly. And as everyone recognizes, there have been a series of different financial market cycles impacting things like technology with the growth of unicorn companies, or the ebullience of the biopharma markets driving record numbers of IPOs and capital raises. Certainly our investors want to hear about those opportunities in the market and our strategies there. And then they often ask, so why are you guys the last remaining firm to do medical device investing? It's a very different way of approaching that conversation. I think there are some reasons that they're asking those questions. A lot of the challenges they hear about come from some of our peers in the market. And so we'll spend a minute talking about how those things have evolved in our space, maybe with a more current update, I think, on where they're at and how we view investing around those kinds of challenges and, frankly, leveraging them to be more successful as investors. So I'd say, around 2007 was a period when the medical device investment market was actually quite healthy. There were a lot of very active investors, capital inflows into the space, and exit activity was at a fairly cyclical high. Some of that was in response to perceptions that there were new opportunities in medical device for creating big companies with reduced regulatory burden and more expedited paths to value creation. Some of that was also reflective of attitudes people had about biopharma, post-Vioxx and a number of other decisions around regulation of diabetes drugs and other select major market categories. People perceived that the bar was going up dramatically in the pharmaceutical space. And so we saw, in many ways, a shift in investment interest and dollars into the medical device space. People, I think, recognize, though, that changed pretty dramatically. Actually, around 2008, fairly concurrent with the change in administration, we saw a fairly noticeable shift towards conservatism at FDA. We observed that the standards for review as well as review times were getting much more complex and more drawn out, which implies things like greater capital requirements for our companies, as well as greater expectations among investors at multiple stages, not just the venture stage, but even later stage, like IPO market investors or institutional buyers in our markets, that the bar was going to go up to demonstrate that we had taken enough risk off the table in our companies and there was a value creation path that would be reflected in revenue and adoption. And so accordingly, we saw capital requirements go up due to the delays in advancing programs to market, and we saw a significant recession in the number of investors actively investing in medical device, and I'll share a couple numbers that illustrate that. The sort of natural reaction in that sort of 2010 to 2014 window was that, again, many investors pulled back, and those that remained active in the space frequently looked for opportunities that maybe a 510K regulatory path presented for a less burdensome review, perhaps less clinical data requirements or projects that required less follow-up. Frequently people would try to identify the last round of investment where if they just added on to that last financing for a company before, achieving revenue, et cetera, or after they had at least navigated the regulatory hurdles, that there would be some venture returns there. And as you can imagine, even with a pullback in the number of investors and dollars available, there aren't lots and lots of investment opportunities where those kinds of sort of late stage de-risked investments present, highly attractive valuation opportunities due to competition. And so we saw some investors be selectively successful with that strategy, but not in a really broad-based way. Of course, all of that attention at later stage opportunities was drawing some of that capital away from earlier stage investment and capital availability particularly to companies that were pursuing much more capital intensive clinical development plans and PMA pathways, to the point where you could almost generate a list looking at the number of VCs that led a Series A or a Series B as a new investor in a PMA path project, and find that there was half a dozen actively investing in that space, and few, if any, were doing more than one or two of those deals in a 2 or 3 year period. We did see a number of strategics step up to participate in that funding cycle, increasingly leaning into venture financings at earlier stages. Some of that has shifted as different expectations by their investors around managing earnings per share and focusing on additional strategies around tax and sort of mega mergers and some of those synergies have drawn their attention. But overall, the strategics in our space have actually been a very good and reliable partner for our companies at multiple stages of development. In the end, we still observe that the best companies were getting funded, and so we should talk a bit about what does it mean to be some of the best opportunities. What are those characteristics? I added this sort of set of screenshots from Monty Python because many people would say, bring out your dead in the medical device industry. And as we try to answer quite loudly, and I'll share with you, we're not dead yet. I thought we'd spend a minute though looking at some of the data that just supports that overview that I walked you through. So this will maybe be difficult to read from even the front row, but basically 3 charts illustrating a few different points around the dollars invested in number of deals on an annual basis into the medical device sector. You'll notice right around 2008, there's a fairly noticeable decline in dollars. Similarly, valuations, even a more marked decline. And similarly, reflected in the changes in PMA review times and approvals by FDA. That dramatic increase in review time and the reduced number or probability of seeing your PMA approved in a timely basis had a huge impact on extending the time that investors had to support these companies to that ultimate value creation milestone and or the ability to then get into the market and start selling. Additional time means additional capital. We support these companies, and for a company that is maybe in the clinical development stage running a pivotal trial or having its PMA reviewed is probably burning north of $1 million a month. So something on the order of a 6 to 10 month delay in that process is almost effectively an entire round of financing put into a company's bank account, invested, burned, and very little to show for it in terms of fundamental milestones in moving that program forward. That's obviously very hard to sustain, for any syndicate, let alone the entire sector. And so, we observed that through, frankly, a lot of proactive engagement with FDA, we were able to identify this problem and walk FDA through an understanding that, reasonable regulatory standards are actually quite good for our industry. We want people, but whether it's someone buying our companies or patients or doctors deciding to use our products, to have a high degree of confidence in the efficacy and safety and the risk-benefit associated with our products. But there are ways in which those reasonable standards, need to be focused and made sure that they're asking questions and managing this process in a way that equally encourages innovation as well as ensures patient safety. And to his credit, and I think Mike Coyle mentioned that Jeff Shuren has been a great partner to the agency. He was really in a leadership role at the outset of these challenges, and absolutely worked very closely with innovative companies and big companies in our space to better understand the impact of regulatory delay and what it means to have a least burdensome path through the regulatory approval process. And again, to his credit, he's survived administrative changes and, frankly, is one of the most engaged people at FDA in working with us to do the best job possible for our industry. I would say, another thing we pay attention to on the investment front is the exit environment. Obviously, we're all investing for sake of creating returns for our investors, and we want to see that the value we create in our companies through good clinical data and execution and teeing up things for market development and successful commercialization will be rewarded in the valuations that are given to our companies. And there's two paths for that. There's the IPO market where we take a company public and sell some of our shares over time to public investors. Those companies are accorded a valuation in the markets that obviously reflects, hopefully a meaningful delta over where we put money in. And then there's the M&A exit, where companies like Medtronic or J&J or Boston Scientific or Teleflex are interested in the products and companies that we have developed to a point where they feel confident that they will take that asset or that program or that therapeutic opportunity and really build it into their business and hopefully develop the market even far beyond what a venture-backed company could do. I'd say, at a very high level, and we can talk about this in some more detail, the IPO market has been fairly tepid in the medical device sector. There are a number of medical device-focused sort of healthcare specialists, but a relatively limited number in the public markets, such that they have a significant amount of leverage or control effectively around pricing these issues. Compared to the biopharma space, their conservatism is pretty marked. And so, the best metric by which they're starting to be comfortable with understanding the potential value over time of a new medical technology comes directly from U.S. physician or hospital user experience reflected in revenue. Rare is the IPO that is a pre-revenue stage company or even at a probably $30 to $50 million revenue run rate. And that's okay. Companies should go public at a time when they are ready to perform in a fairly predictable way and continue to invest capital from that IPO raise and create additional value. At the same time, having a viable IPO path does create pressure against our opportunity or how we think about whether and when we might consider a company selling to an acquirer. Now that said, the acquisition sort of M&A market has been relatively strong, particularly for companies that have invested in what I'll call bona fide innovations, things that may require a PMA or a significant investment in clinical data that's randomized and robust level 1 evidence to prove its value, both in terms of clinical outcomes as well as healthcare economics. And when you even compare the magnitude of outcomes associated with investment returns for the medical device sector against the biopharma sector, where many people recognize the returns have been excellent, the multiples paid for our companies relative to the capital invested is actually quite compelling. Just another comment to say, well, I think that the conditions as they've evolved through, the last 3 to 4 years have actually been increasingly stabilizing. We have seen a number of inflows into the healthcare investing category for venture capital funds. Groups like NEA, as well as our peers that may be solely focused on healthcare, have been quite successful in raising new funds. There's still a relatively smaller percentage of dollars being raised in the venture capital business going to medical device. I think it's stabilized from sort of the 2014, 15, 16 levels. And 2017 looks like it's going to be about on par with where 2016 was. So I think, these markets have rebounded and are stable. I wouldn't say that there is an oversupply of capital by any means. And in particular, when we talk about earlier stage investing and translating ideas and concepts into products, there is still a significant scarcity of capital. So despite the headwinds and some of the extended timelines associated with investing, why did we sort of stick to our guns and continue to invest fairly actively? We're probably committing upwards of $300 million per fund, or about $100 million plus a year to different medical device opportunities. We have an active portfolio of about 35 companies, and I mentioned over 14 PMAs in the last 5 years, a fairly significant percentage of the total number of PMAs approved, particularly by sort of private companies. Broadly, we look at the sort of macro opportunity and try to identify what's the difference between a secular and a cyclical trend. I think the secular market dynamics for the medical device and healthcare technology industry are actually quite strong. Obviously, healthcare is an increasingly important percentage of our GDP. There are, demographic drivers of consumption, and despite a lot of the different changing payment models associated with Obamacare or alternatives that are still quite dynamic, we believe that medical device innovation and healthcare technology can do a lot to improve outcomes that reduce cost. And while we increasingly focus on demonstrating that in our clinical trials, we find that our partners in the ecosystem recognize it as well. Similarly, from an investor perspective, if you think about fear and greed and you want to be greedy when others are fearful, we have recognized that having capital in a space where there has been a retrenchment in investment has created additional investment opportunities for us. So we are moving into earlier stages of investment while others have been shifting to later. We're able to make investments in companies where we believe quite strongly in the value proposition of that company over the long term and a reasonable path of investment in generating evidence to support that. And we can do so at relatively lower valuations than we could have in years past. And so we've been selectively but very actively taking advantage of those market conditions and planting seeds that we think will generate great investment returns in years to come. Similarly, I've talked about the importance of M&A in our space. We believe the conditions remain very healthy for a continued M&A cycle. The cost of capital for buyers in our space remains extremely low in the grand scheme of things, whether that's debt or equity capital. And similarly, their need for growth, and we'll talk about this a little bit more, has almost never been stronger. There have been a lot of strategies over the last 5 to 7 years focused on consolidation of large companies to drive M&A synergy. Many have tried to optimize their tax brackets by looking at OUS combinations and other strategies for that. And to some extent, very aggressively curbing R&D spending or focusing it on select key areas. Ultimately, we like to say you can only do so much cutting and merging and synergizing to drive growth in your business. And while we've seen, I think, good gains in bottom line growth and productivity, there is still a significant need for top line revenue organic growth at many of the companies in our sector. And fundamentally in our ecosystem, we think that's our opportunity to be a good partner and provide that early stage innovation that can fund that. And we'll talk more about that in a minute. So I tried to put together this sort of graphic to talk a little bit about our innovation ecosystem. And we think very actively about this as a venture investor that's trying to figure out the right way of stimulating and funding innovation as it makes the transition from an idea to an actual business opportunity. At a very broad level, I'd say there are 3 phases of product development and evidence generation that position something to be a true business or a product that's sold into the market. And when you think about the broader ecosystem, there are innovative startup companies on the early side of the spectrum and much more mature, commercially expert companies on the later end of the spectrum. And when we think about investing, both to start companies as well as when to exit those companies, we want to think about where are the competitive advantages of each of the players in this ecosystem. And I try to boil it down into an idea that, by being small and very focused, there are certain inherent advantages that come to a startup company when it comes to identifying unmet needs, generating early evidence of proof of concept, and even efficiently executing on later stages of clinical development and regulatory approval. At the other end of the spectrum, our companies like Medtronic are excellent at leveraging the benefits of scale and the economies of scale that accrue to things like quality and manufacturing systems, process improvement, global distribution, and in many ways market expansion, taking innovative technologies, plugging it into a portfolio of products or a care pathway where we think about the value-based healthcare economic proposition to a customer base and really magnifying that in a way that an independent company couldn't. So obviously in this sort of ecosystem, we try to be providing a feeder for innovative products that ultimately contribute to revenue growth and new market opportunities, as well as ways of driving increased profits and bottom line growth to the Medtronics of the world, in exchange for which they're providing us active support by acquiring those companies and frequently co-investing with us to encourage investment innovations that will be most impactful to them. Just to sort of emphasize a little bit of that driver too in the ecosystem, Organic growth is one of the things that's, I think, most precious these days in large cap medical device companies. This is a JP Morgan graphic that illustrates, I think maybe 12 of the highest quality, most capable large cap medical device companies in the world, but a relatively limited number who have been able to put together consecutive quarters of 5% organic growth or greater on the top line. And if you thought about where the medical device industry was 15 years ago, it was really characterized by double-digit growth and an expectation that this was a category that benefited from very high gross margins, long-term durable franchise opportunities in product categories, and significant growth, both top line and bottom line. And the major driver that has caused some challenges in sustained organic growth of these companies are that there were really several blockbuster categories that the medical device industry pioneered quite successfully for the benefit of everyone in our healthcare system, including orthopedics like hips and knee implants, the whole CRM franchise focused on implanted cardiac defibrillators and pacemakers, as well as the stent business. Like a big pharma company, these became, $5 to $10 billion plus annual industries, enjoyed by multiple players in different parts of those clinical areas. And over time, they have become relatively commoditized. Pricing pressure has crept in, and we can talk about some of the pressures that maybe hospitals or other customers are exerting, as well as the inherent competition across fairly mature product portfolios. But these product categories remain significant drivers of the profitability for our companies in these markets. And yet we need to figure out ways that innovation can either create new categories like transcatheter valves or incremental innovations that maybe touch on these categories and help drive additional sales and market share taking. So when it comes to NEA's investment strategies, let me try to kind of transition a little bit and think about ways in which those market conditions we just talked through are informing the different maybe phases of investment and how we're targeting different types of companies. This is a graphic that just illustrates a few of the different stages, maybe categorized by stages of investment like seed and Series A, mid stages like Series B and C, and then later stages, what we often call expansion or venture growth equity opportunities. In each of the blue boxes, we try to call out some of the major drivers of our investment thesis in different spaces. Whether we believe that investing early in a startup gives us the opportunity to meaningfully de-risk a technology opportunity and then follow on with incrementally lower risk capital, but still very attractive on an IRR basis. In the middle stages, this has been a bit of a no man's land, as discussed previously. Companies that are probably ready to start a pivotal study, but needing to access on the order of $25 to $50 million of capital to get all the way through the regulatory approval process. And then in select opportunities, much later stage investment where some clinical value proposition has been proven, but there is a market development opportunity in place. And we think that particularly for funds at our scale, we can be a great commercial partner to those companies. So this is sort of the gratuitous, venture capital investor slide in the medical device space, listing all the things we care about in our diligence process. And I assure you, each of these are very fundamental, regardless of what stage we might consider investing at. But I thought I'd advance to another slide to really think about most tangibly how we're very focused on picking that moment on a per project basis. We think a lot, given the sort of overall environment and the availability of capital, about the ultimate value creation time point that's going to be recognized for one of our companies. That is to say, whether we're going to build a standalone business that could go public and be a long-term independent franchise opportunity, we recognize that public market investors to do that want to see a certain amount of commercial traction and scale. If we think a company or a program is better suited for acquisition, as is probably the case in 90% of our companies, we think a lot about when are we likely to see several buyers show interest in getting involved and acquiring that company or partnering with us to fund it the rest of the way to a point where they will want to acquire it formally. At a very high level, my observation is that the highest degree of confidence I have in answering that question is the point at which that new product or innovative opportunity is really ready to be commercialized in the U.S. at scale, leveraging the sort of economies of scale that our acquirers tend to have. ideally even more ready for global commercialization, because that the emerging market growth and broad global distribution is an increasingly important driver of the businesses for our acquirers. So if we work backwards from where we think somebody's going to be ready to pick this up, we want to think about each of these different 9 phases of sort of validation of a technology. And I want to highlight a couple of these because there are some major gates when thinking about when is something really going to be accessible for commercialization in the U.S. Certainly, you need regulatory approval. In certain product categories in the medical device industry, there are existing reimbursement frameworks around coding, coverage, and payment for technologies so that if you bring something to market, there is a way to get paid for it. And that is a fundamentally important area to identify for any new innovative opportunity. Whether your invention or program can fit under an existing reimbursement framework is a key question for evaluating whether or not, once approved by regulators and FDA, it's going to be ready to go to market and scale in a manner that becomes accretive to a buyer. If that's not the case, we recognize that there is additional evidence frequently needed to be gathered through additional clinical studies and a process of securing coding, coverage, and payment that takes a lot of time and investment. So we're not shy to invest in areas that are highly innovative and there may be no payment framework for that kind of opportunity, but we recognize that the total capital requirement to reach that phase when we've established those things and it's really ready for broader distribution and productive scaling is something we have to factor into how much capital this company is going to need from start to finish. In the case where there may be an innovative product opportunity that does fit into that paradigm, we're actually going to be much more comfortable going to an early stage of investing. And ideally, one of these earlier phases, may be the really hard thing that we need to prove as an innovator to convince others, because these other downstream boxes are checked, we've gotten over the really hard thing. So I'll give you an example. One of our companies in the AFib ablation space developed a very novel approach to ablating cardiac tissue that integrates the ability to sense temperature of the tissue in real time and provide a closed-loop feedback mechanism by which we can dial up or down the energy that's being delivered to the heart on every ablation. Now, this has been sort of long sought-after capability that we think can add improvements to procedure time as well as improved clinical outcomes and durability over the long term, reduced redo procedure rates, et cetera. But we really need to prove that technology capability is locked down in a product that has attractive cost of goods, highly reliable, and is in a form factor that will be readily adopted and used as a workhorse product by investigators. Downstream of that, we understand that the clinical development pathway for such a technology is actually quite well worn. There have been 4 or 5 companies in our space that have gotten PMA approvals for their products in this category. And beyond that, the reimbursement framework is already well established. There's a DRG. The payments for that DRG have actually been increasing 20 to 25% over the last several years. And so when we focus on an investment opportunity in that space, we're thinking about how do we really demonstrate this value proposition, that this technology has great clinical utility. So we actually started, at a very preclinical stage to pick that company up. And we'll be funding it all the way through its pivotal clinical development program. Whether or not it's amenable for acquisition of that phase, we'll see. If it's not, we're actually quite comfortable taking on the risk of the regulatory review process and beyond. But we definitely think about, total capital requirement to get to that bona fide exit window for multiple different acquirers and where we want to start in that process to establish an ownership stake and allocate capital at a scale that matters to us. Just a little bit more on thinking about some of our criteria, and I'll call out a few of these things that we've been most actively thinking about because it may inform how you guys think about innovations you're considering and some of the key features that we really like to see in our companies. On the prior slide, we talked about how we gate investments according to the milestone and the total capital requirement. Obviously, some things that have a dramatic influence on the total capital requirement and timelines are things like the nature of the clinical study that you may need to run. We actually believe quite strongly in investing in very robust level 1 clinical trials, but things like the duration of the primary endpoint, whether you can demonstrate, on a primary endpoint that FDA will look at for regulatory approval or payers will assess for the economic value of something, is provable in 3 months versus 2 years, and in how many patients does it require to demonstrate statistical and significance and clinical validity on that endpoint, has a great deal of impact on the expense associated with that clinical investment. In specific clinical indications where you can generate a lot of economic value by running a clinical trial that has a 3-month endpoint is a much more attractive opportunity than something with a 5-year, follow-up period that has a mortality endpoint. We also like to weave a lot of health economic evidence development and collection into our clinical trials. In many cases, we try to focus on those innovations where there's just a prima facie case to be made for cost savings inherent in maybe being able to transition a procedure from a more expensive, acute environment to a less expensive center, or the clinical outcomes may benefit things like mortality or hospital readmission, et cetera. Increasingly, we've been active in investing in energy-based devices where we may apply energy in some manner that fundamentally alters structure or physiology in an organ system, and we do so because we think there are real benefits to avoiding having an implant in the body. Historically, there is an extra layer of scrutiny anytime you're going to apply a medical device to a patient that they're going to take home with them and live with, potentially for the rest of their lives, whether it's in terms of biocompatibility, long-term durability, replacement cycles. To the extent you can avoid that and still create a very meaningful clinical outcome for patients with an energy-based solution is something that we like a lot. I mentioned the opportunity to leverage existing reimbursement frameworks. Absolutely accelerates the path from innovation to marketplace. We also think a lot about business model, whether it's one of our companies or how a product may fit within an acquirer. We think a lot about the margin opportunity as well as the overall market growth, and the nature of the business is one creating a recurring revenue stream that's predictable and long-term is actually quite compelling. Similarly, we think a lot about the sort of direct value opportunity for an innovation where we may be able to sell a product that is a billable product opportunity in and of itself, but then has the opportunity to directly impact the sales of other products in a company's portfolio. So I'll give an example that Mike spoke of. Tyrex was actually a venture-backed startup company that developed that novel infection-reducing antibacterial, antimicrobial envelope for products. He did an excellent job describing the overall health economic proposition by reducing infection rates and by presenting that kind of opportunity for hospitals for savings and contracting the way that they do. There's a $1,000 per Tyrex product revenue opportunity direct to Medtronic associated with that. The other layer to that strategy that I think is extremely compelling is when you talk about that value proposition of using that product and the Medtronic sales rep or whoever's working with a hospital to develop that kind of program, there's an inherent assumption that Medtronic is also going to be selling more of their ICDs and pacemakers that are a companion product to that. And that is a massive market opportunity to take share from other competitors in that space who don't have that Tyrex product as a companion. And so when you think about investing in a Tyrex, there's obviously the opportunity to generate as many sales of $1,000 per case sales of that product, but there's also an important implication for what having that product in a diversified product portfolio does for impacting the sales of another very profitable, very large market in terms of shifting share. So we think very actively about that and the ways in which our innovative products could provide that type of leverage for our acquirers. The last comment I'll make is when we look at investing in a medical device opportunity, we try to look beyond. I think there was a great quote about what Earl Bakken said, look beyond what is apparent. I may have messed that up, but that's actually exactly what we try to do when looking at investing in innovative companies. There may be a linear value creation story that relates to getting to proof of concept, running the clinical study for pivotal evidence, getting regulatory approval, getting to the market, and generating revenue around that product. But if we can identify other ways in which incremental investment can expand the usable market opportunity for that product, whether it's a second indication in another clinical trial, or leveraging the inherent skills and capabilities of an R&D group to make a second product that fits in the same channel alongside of that primary product we're investing in. We're very active in trying to flesh out those kinds of investment cases. You know, when we invest, we take on all kinds of risks around team and timelines, and we try to mitigate some of that risk or at least absorb it into additional investment opportunities by pursuing those strategies. So I don't know how I did on time, but that kind of concludes my prepared remarks, and look forward to chatting with everybody here and Vanessa as part of our next phase.